Live from Abu Dhabi, you're at the Global Exchange with John Defterios.
Welcome to the Exchange, where we explore emerging markets, the engine of global growth. Tonight, Egypt's major sell-off. Two frontrunners of the presidential election emerge, alarming investors. Stocks plummet to a two-month low. The two most talked about topics in Europe at the moment, austerity and growth. We head to Kazakhstan to hear from some of the world's top economic minds on the debate from the Astana Economic Forum. Well, growth and stability are not only Egyptian priorities. Let's take a look at Europe and its emerging markets. Right now, their leaders are doing their best to strike a balance between budget austerity and reviving growth. That debate took center stage at the annual Astana Economic Forum in Kazakhstan. Some of the world's top economic leaders gathered in the fast-growing country, positioned between Russia and China. Four of them joined our Nina Dos Santos to share views on what ultimately will get the world economy moving again.
Let me introduce my panel of esteemed four guests to my right and to my left. Starting out with my right, Min Zhu, who is the Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. He's also a former Deputy Governor of the People's Bank of China. Thank you so much for joining us. Jacob Frenkel, further to my right, who's the Chairman of JP Morgan Chase, one of the world's largest financial institutions. And to my left, we have Alejandro Jara, who joins us as the Deputy Director General of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and Romano Prodi, last but not least, who was the former Prime Minister of Italy. Let's start out with Min Zhu. First of all, obviously representing the International Monetary Fund, you've been very much in the eye of the limelight, let's say, perhaps even the eye of the storm, because you've been having to help so many countries that are having a hard time around the world, notably in Europe. Your main priority, you've been saying often, is to get growth going again, but you also acknowledge that that is probably one of the biggest challenges of our age.
Well, the main challenge you obviously laid out. One thing is our mandate to maintain global financial stability and economic stability. And a part of stability comes from the growth, because if you don't have growth, it's hard to have economic and financial stability. So we need to do both. And given currently the debt ratio is still way high, I just mentioned, with all these austerity programs in the advanced economy, for example, the debt ratio is still on upside, not on downside. We forecast the debt ratio to GDP probably will be stabilized in 2016. At that time, end up with 115% of GDP. So the debt ratio is still way high. So we have to cut the debt. We have to do the fiscal consolidation. But meanwhile, the growth is relatively weak. This year is a 3.25%, and lower than 4% last year. And advanced economy particularly weak, have only 1.5% of GDP growth rates, and the European have a negative growth rate. It's run into a mild recession. So growth is always important. But I would like to emphasize, answering the message is not to do austerity or the growth. We need both.
Let me come to you, Romano Prodi. Obviously, as the former Prime Minister of Italy, Italy is one of those countries that people are becoming increasingly worried about their sort of debt to GDP ratio. How difficult is it when you're in a position of power, you're politically elected, to actually cut that debt?
And the Italian budget now is perfectly in order. You know, we have an outstanding debt that is 120% of GDP, so it's very heavy. But it was the same when we entered into the euro. You know, we didn't move. It's the international situation that changed it. You know, and what is happening now in Europe, not only in Italy but overall Europe and even South Europe, that the policies of the government are completely constrained by the international finance movement. You know, you mentioned that we need growth and stability together. You know, but how can you get it when you're? I think that our sovereignty is limited now.
Are you talking about a lack of sovereignty because of the fiscal framework that the EU leaders are trying to push through to try and solve some of the ills in the Eurozone crisis? Or are you talking about the fact that some countries are getting just priced out of the bond market?
No, I am, when I talk of lack of sovereignty, you have to consider it literally. Let's say the governments, in the idea of the modern state, they take the decision for the country. Now they cannot take the decision for the country because they are limited by this environment. And this is why it's clear the outcome for Europe is only to stick together, to become as big as the United States or China, and so you will not be attacked and your sovereignty will be safe. So we keep sovereignty only if we bring the sovereignty at a European level.
Is it worth saving the Eurozone at any cost?
Once you pose the question in this way, the word any cost, then obviously there must be some cost where it's not worth it. But the question is, can one deal with it in an acceptable cost? But in order to go about it, let me start by fully agreeing with my good friend Min Zhu, which says the choice, so to speak, between austerity and growth is a fallacious choice. You do not have this choice. If you could choose, who would like to go for austerity if you could have growth? That's not the issue. And you know, semantics create content. I do suggest that we replace the word austerity with the word responsibility. And we replace the word growth with the word sustainable growth. And once you put it in this context, and you have sustainable growth as an objective, you are forced to think into the medium term and not take shortcuts that give you 1 year boost with long debt thereafter. In terms of the euro, you know, we are talking here about euro is not just a currency. Euro is a system. What we see now, people say there is a crisis in the euro. Others say crisis in the euro system. Euro is a manifestation of the system. Let's face it, at the present time, the members of the Eurozone are very, very different in many dimensions.
When we come back, we'll hear more from our panel in Astana, especially one of the lessons Europe could learn from developing markets. But first, Marketplace Africa is right after the break. 89. We want to now return you to Kazakhstan and the CNN discussion at the Astana Economic Forum. In part one, the conversation centered on Europe and the fierce debate over austerity and growth. Now the discussion shifts to the developing countries and their role in the global economy.
The European crisis is important in world economy, and President Obama is very, very worried that the European crisis can modify also the American policy, you know, because Europe is a giant. We are really still number one in world economy, but we are divided. We are divided. This is the problem, you know. But going to Kazakhstan, really, the country is a key country in the sense that geographically, you know, is an enormous country, bigger than Europe in terms of area, yep. In terms of surface, one of the biggest in the world, you know, after Russia, Canada, and Brazil is the biggest of the world. Place it strategically between East and West, and with a lot of natural resources. And so they are using this for changing the economy, until now is really a great success. But clearly now the economy is still dependent on the price of raw material, you know. So it's similar from this point of view to the Russian economy. You may have a very prosperous budget and surplus to jump and to invest only in the price of oil, coal, and so on.
They have been very successful when they had a banking crisis in tackling it immediately. That is one of the big successes that Kazakhstan has had too. Could we learn something, given the fact that Europe is facing perhaps a systemic banking crisis of its own?
No, you know, you tackle the problem. When you talk about Europe, you talk about a big entity with big potential, but without any central decision-making power in this moment.
Alejandro, let me come to you. Should the G20 countries be playing more of a role or being allowed to play more of a role here? They are, economically speaking, the ones with the clout, or at least the growth.
I think the G20 countries are the most important countries from an economic and probably political point of view in the world, and they have a responsibility. They are there to interact at the highest political level to solve problems that cannot be solved otherwise, okay? So normally, they go, when there's no consensus, the leaders have to deal with those problems at the level of G20. And they have to do it in a very decisive way, achieve international cooperation, which later gets translated into action in the respective fora, be it IMF, WTO, wherever it is. So they're not an international organization per se, but they are the, I would say, the summary of decisive political energy that you need to solve the problems. And in this world, I heard some time ago a president of Central Bank of Latin American country say, I am sure the politicians take the right decisions at the end of the day. The problem is that the markets don't wait for them. You have to step in sooner, you have to be decisive, and you have to get good functional political institutions to be able to react quickly to the kinds of problems, and in this sense, in this atmosphere, you need international, better and more international cooperation among countries, and the G20 has a decisive role to play in that respect.
Well, Minju, you're obviously the embodiment of that, really, aren't you? Now as Deputy MD of the International Monetary Fund, you are Deputy Governor of the People's Bank of China. The G20 countries, should they be allowed to step up to the table and play more of a role?
It seems to me G20 should play a more important role. They represent 85% of global GDP. And G20 worked well in 2008 and 2009, getting all the countries together, put the money on the table, did the stimulus, pull the global economy out of big potential recessions. And they could and they should do more.
It's not an accident that Latin America, that was the place where so many crises started, came out clean this time. It's not an accident that Southeast Asia, that had the Asian crisis, came out clean this time. Why is it? The reason is they were lucky enough to have their crisis earlier, and they've learned a lesson. And the two major lessons are, you cannot sustain a crisis if your financial system is weak. You must have strong banks, highly required capital ratios, and number one. Number two, your budget must be in line. And I think that those two lessons that the previous crisis-prone countries learned, this time it is for the advanced economy. Number three, G20, IMF. I think that any grouping helps if it can do something. But let's face it, there is a fundamental difference between all the groups and the IMF or the World Bank for that matter. The IMF has a legal mandate, a legal structure, a legal backing of countries that have committed to underwrite it, to pay dues and all the rest. Of course, if you are large enough like a G20, you can influence the ultimate decisions, but I really feel it should be done in the board of the IMF because it's the only universal global institution, and we are moving away from the world in which the big guys can decide everything for the small guys because the small guys are growing fast.
Jacob Frenkel, chairman of J.P. Morgan Chase International, summarizing the debate in Astana and what we talk about every day here on the Global Exchange.